You ever witness a moment so raw, so unexpected, that it flips the entire power dynamic of a room upside down? One of those scenes where arrogance tries to crush dignity, only to be shattered by something far stronger? That's exactly what happened one night in a lavish 5-star restaurant, where a billionaire thought he could humiliate someone simply because he believed she didn't understand him. What he never imagined was that the waitress he mocked would speak back to him, in his own language, fluently, and leave him stunned into silence. Before I dive into this story, let me stop here for a second. If you love narratives that reveal the hidden layers of human strength, if you believe arrogance always meets its downfall, then make sure you subscribe to this channel right now. Don't just watch, be part of this journey. Hit that like button, drop a comment with your thoughts, and share this video so more people can see the truth behind stories like this. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Now, let's set the scene. It was late evening, the kind of night where the wealthy gathered to flaunt their influence. The restaurant was buzzing with laughter, clinking glasses, and the hushed murmurs of business deals being whispered over expensive wine. In the corner, near a table draped in pristine white linen, stood a young black waitress. Her name? Maya. She had one of those presences that quietly lit up a room, not by demanding attention but by carrying herself with a quiet confidence. Her posture was straight, her eyes sharp, and even though her job was to serve, she moved with the grace of someone who knew her worth. The billionaire who sat at her table, let's call him Khaled, was different. He wasn't used to being ignored or challenged. Everything about him screamed control. The tailored suit, the gold cufflinks, the bodyguard stationed a few feet away. He lived in a world where money wasn't just power, it was the rule of law. People bowed to it, adjusted their tone around it, and tried to win favor with it. To him, Maya was invisible, just another pair of hands delivering plates and pouring wine. But here's where it gets interesting. Khaled leaned toward his friend at the table, smirking, and began speaking rapidly in Arabic. His voice carried just enough for Maya to catch it, though she pretended not to. His words weren't kind. They were sharp, mocking, dripping with the kind of disdain people use when they think the person they're insulting will never understand. He laughed under his breath, his companion chuckling along, as if Maya's very presence was some kind of private joke. This is where most people would shrink back, smile politely, pretend they hadn't heard. But Maya wasn't most people, and what happened next would leave everyone in that restaurant, servers, guests, and even Khaled himself, completely stunned. For a moment, Maya kept her composure, balancing the tray in her hands as though she hadn't heard a single word. But her mind was already racing. She had worked in this restaurant long enough to recognize the look, the sly grin, the dismissive tone, the little digs made under the assumption that she wouldn't understand. She had endured whispers in French, sneers in Italian, jokes in Spanish, and every single time she had chosen silence. Not because she couldn't respond, but because she understood something most of her customers didn't. Silence can be louder than words. But tonight felt different. Maybe it was the way Khaled didn't just mock her appearance, but went further, commenting on how people like her would never rise above serving drinks, how her accent in English must sound amusing to those who spoke real languages. His arrogance wasn't just casual, it was venomous. And when venom spills into the air, sometimes silence isn't enough. She set the tray down on the edge of the table with deliberate grace, her eyes flicking up just long enough to meet his. In that split second, Khaled expected nothing, certainly not defiance. To him, she was background noise, an accessory to his evening. Then Maya opened her mouth. In fluent, impeccable Arabic, she looked him dead in the eyes and said, "You think I don't understand you, but arrogance blinds more than ignorance ever could." The words landed like a thunderclap. His smirk vanished, replaced by the kind of stunned expression people wear when the ground beneath them suddenly shifts. His friend froze mid-laugh, eyes darting between the two as if to confirm he hadn't misheard. And the surrounding tables, which had been buzzing with casual chatter, fell quiet, the weight of Maya's words cutting through the air. The power dynamic flipped in an instant. The billionaire who thought he held all the control suddenly looked small, fragile even, stripped of the comfort that comes from assuming nobody can challenge you. And Maya, no longer just a waitress, stood taller than anyone in that room. But here's the thing about moments like this. They don't just happen in a vacuum. When someone speaks truth to arrogance, it sends ripples. People start to look at themselves differently. Guests at nearby tables began whispering. The staff, many of whom had silently endured similar treatment, felt an unexpected surge of pride. Even the maitre d', a man usually quick to appease the wealthy elite, stood frozen, as though unsure whether to intervene or simply let this moment play out. Maya didn't linger on the tension. She didn't raise her voice or dramatize her words. Instead, she continued in Arabic, weaving her reply with the kind of calm precision that comes from years of practice. She told him that she had studied languages not to impress anyone, but to connect with the world, that every word he thought was his weapon was, to her, just another doorway to understanding. The beauty of it wasn't just in the language itself. It was in the way she embodied something deeper: dignity, resilience, a refusal to be diminished by someone else's shallow view. And for the first time in perhaps a very long while, Khaled had no comeback. He sat back in his chair, eyes narrowing, searching for control he no longer had. But the room had already judged. No one spoke aloud, yet the silence itself felt like a verdict. The billionaire, who was used to commanding attention, had been outshone by the very person he tried to belittle. And Maya? She didn't gloat. She didn't smile in triumph. She simply straightened her shoulders, gathered the empty glasses from the table and walked away, leaving behind a silence thicker than any insult could have created. But here's the real twist. That wasn't the end of it. Because arrogance rarely retreats quietly. And the way Khaled responded after that moment would prove whether he had truly been humbled, or whether he would strike back with the only power he thought he still had. For a few long seconds, Khaled sat frozen, his fingers gripping the edge of the tablecloth as though he needed something solid to keep him grounded. His jaw clenched, his eyes darted, and yet the words he was so used to throwing like daggers never came. In his world, silence was something imposed on others, not on him. And yet here he was, caught in it, suffocated by it. His companion shifted uncomfortably in his chair, breaking the tension with a nervous cough. She spoke perfect Arabic, he muttered, as if Khaled hadn't noticed. That only twisted the knife deeper. Khaled hated being exposed, especially in public. His fortune had shielded him for years from ridicule, from being placed in a position where his authority wasn't absolute. To be undone by a waitress, in front of strangers, unthinkable. The restaurant's atmosphere had changed. The quiet hum of voices hadn't returned. People were still watching, pretending to carry on conversations but stealing glances at the billionaire whose arrogance had just imploded in his face. Even the waitstaff, who had mastered the art of blending into the background, couldn't help but hover nearby, eyes flicking toward Maya with an unspoken admiration. But humiliation does strange things to people. Some retreat humbled, others lash out. And Khaled was not the type to bow his head and accept defeat. He forced a laugh, sharp and hollow, trying to reclaim the stage. Impressive, he said loudly, in English this time so everyone could hear. Our waitress is a scholar. Maybe she should sit at the table instead of serving it. His tone dripped with sarcasm, but beneath it was a tremor, a crack in the armor he desperately wanted to keep intact. Maya didn't turn back. She kept walking, her tray balanced effortlessly, her expression calm. That, more than her words, unnerved him. He wasn't used to being dismissed. Power, after all, thrives on reaction. Without it, arrogance withers. His companion leaned closer, whispering something Khaled didn't like. The billionaire's face darkened, his pride spiraling into something darker: anger. He flagged down the maitre d', demanding to know the waitress's name, his voice rising just enough for the surrounding tables to hear. It wasn't just about Maya anymore. It was about reestablishing dominance, reminding everyone that he was still the man with influence, the man no one dared to cross. But here's the thing. Arrogance might buy fear, but it can't buy respect. And respect is what everyone in that restaurant now felt for Maya. The maitre d', usually quick to appease high-paying customers, hesitated. His eyes flicked toward Maya, then back to Khaled, as though weighing the cost of obedience. That hesitation was another blow, a subtle, silent rebellion against the hierarchy Khaled believed was unshakable. Khaled's temper flared. "Do you understand who I am?" he barked, his voice cutting through the room. It wasn't a question, it was a threat, the kind of phrase men like him had wielded for decades to remind the world of their status. But tonight, it sounded desperate, almost pitiful. And in that desperation, the guests saw something they weren't supposed to see. A man terrified of losing control. Meanwhile, Maya slipped into the kitchen, her heart racing, not because she regretted her words, but because she knew what men like Khaled were capable of. She had seen it before, how they turned embarrassment into vengeance, how they used their wealth to punish anyone who dared to bruise their ego. But she also knew something else. Once dignity has been claimed, it can't be taken back. No amount of money could erase what had just happened. Still, the night was far from over, because Khalid wasn't done. And as much as Maya had won the silence of the room, the billionaire was already plotting how to turn that silence into his revenge. Inside the kitchen, the air was thick with heat and noise, the hiss of pans, the clatter of knives, the rhythmic orders barked by the head chef. But for Maya, the chaos was a welcome contrast to the suffocating silence she'd left behind in the dining room. Here, surrounded by steam and sweat, she could finally breathe. Her co-workers had already heard what happened. Word travels fast in spaces like this. A dishwasher glanced at her with wide eyes. Another server, carrying a stack of plates, leaned in close and whispered, "Did you really just speak to him in Arabic?" Maya didn't answer, but the faintest curve of a smile gave her away. The staff, most of whom had endured insults of their own, looked at her differently now, like she'd done something they'd always wanted to do but never dared. But pride is a dangerous luxury in places where power lurks just beyond the door. The maitre d' slipped into the kitchen, his polished shoes out of place against the greasy floor tiles. He scanned the room until his gaze landed on Maya. "What did you say to him?" His voice was low, urgent, tinged with fear rather than curiosity. Maya set down her tray and met his eyes. "The truth," she said simply. The maitre d' exhaled sharply, running a hand over his neatly combed hair. "Do you have any idea who that man is? He's not just another wealthy guest. He's dangerous. He doesn't forget humiliation." Maya didn't flinch. Then maybe it's time someone reminded him he's not untouchable. The maitre d' shook his head, muttering something about consequences, before hurrying back out. But his unease wasn't misplaced. Back in the dining room, Khalid was far from finished. The more he replayed the moment in his mind, the way Maya had cut through his arrogance with effortless fluency, the deeper his humiliation burned. For men like him, power wasn't just wealth. It was image, and that image had just been cracked in front of dozens of witnesses. He leaned toward his companion, his voice low but venomous. "She will regret this." He hissed in Arabic, careful this time to speak under his breath. His companion shifted uneasily, not daring to encourage him but not brave enough to oppose him either. Khalid pulled out his phone, scrolling through contacts with the kind of casual malice reserved for people who believed rules were for others. His world was one where favors could be bought, where reputations could be destroyed with a single phone call. And as his thumb hovered over a name, his lips curved into a smile, a dangerous one. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, Maya tried to steady her breathing. She wasn't naive. She knew she had just ignited something bigger than herself. But she also knew that dignity was not negotiable. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. "They can strip you of everything: money, comfort, even safety, but never give them your dignity. That's yours alone." Still, beneath her calm surface, a flicker of worry stirred. She had seen men like Khalid before. They didn't just bruise, they struck back. And while she didn't regret her words, she understood the storm she had just unleashed. The staff moved around her, some offering quiet nods of solidarity, others avoiding her gaze, afraid of being caught in the fallout. The kitchen felt smaller than ever, as though the walls themselves knew that the boundary between their hidden world and the glittering dining room had just been shattered. Then the maitre d' returned, his face pale. He leaned close to Maya, his voice barely above a whisper. "He asked for your name. He's calling people. I don't know who, but be careful." Maya didn't reply. She simply tightened her apron, squared her shoulders, and went back to work. To her, fear was real, but surrender was not an option. And yet, as the night wore on, the shadow of Khalid's influence began to stretch further than the walls of the restaurant. What happened next would prove that a single act of courage can spark both admiration and retaliation. The night pressed on, but the air inside the restaurant never returned to normal. Guests tried to resume their conversations, but something in the energy lingered. A taut string pulled tight, waiting to snap. The waiters moved a little faster, the laughter at the tables sounded more forced, and every glance toward Khalid carried a silent question. What would he do next? Maya stayed in the kitchen, keeping herself busy with orders, forcing her hands to move even though her thoughts refused to quiet down. Each glass she polished, each plate she carried, felt heavier than usual. It wasn't the work, it was the knowledge that she had crossed an invisible line. She had told herself, you did the right thing. You stood your ground. But doing the right thing rarely came without a price. Out in the dining room, Khaled sat back in his chair, his phone still in his hand. He scrolled through his contacts deliberately, as if he were choosing a weapon. Finally, he made a call. His voice was calm, measured. Too calm for someone whose pride had just been wounded. That calmness was more unsettling than rage. It was the calm of a man who believed consequences were inevitable, because he had the means to enforce them. Within minutes, the restaurant's general manager, a man rarely seen during regular service, appeared. He walked briskly toward Khaled's table, his expression already apologetic. He bowed slightly, whispering, "Mr. Khaled, I was informed there was an issue." Khaled didn't whisper. His voice was sharp, intended for the nearest tables to hear. "One of your waitresses insulted me, in Arabic no less. Do you employ staff who mock their guests openly? Or is this how your establishment operates?" The words cut through the room like a blade. The general manager's face paled as his eyes darted nervously toward the staff. He knew exactly who Khaled was, and more importantly, what losing Khaled's favor could mean. Men like him had the power to close doors, to ruin reputations with a single story whispered in the right ear. Maya felt the tension before she saw it. The kitchen door swung open, and the manager entered, his expression grim. "Maya," he said quietly, "come with me." The room went silent as she stepped out into the dining area. Every eye seemed to follow her. Some guests looked away, ashamed to witness what was happening. Others leaned forward, hungry for spectacle. Khaled watched her approach with a thin smile, a man convinced the scales were about to tip back in his favor. The manager cleared his throat, bowing his head toward the billionaire. "Mr. Khaled, this is the waitress. Whatever misunderstanding occurred, I assure you it will be addressed immediately." Maya stood tall. She could feel her pulse in her throat, but she refused to let her fear show. She looked Khaled in the eye, and for a fleeting second, she saw something raw flicker there. Not power, not confidence, but desperation. His entire identity rested on domination, and she had cracked it. Now he was trying to glue it back together with authority and spectacle. "You see," Khaled said, gesturing toward her as though she were evidence in a trial. "This is the disrespect I spoke of. I will not tolerate being mocked by staff. Either she apologizes publicly, or I will make sure this establishment pays the price." The manager turned to Maya, his eyes pleading. "Just say you're sorry, please." But apologizing would mean erasing everything she had stood for. It would mean bowing to the same arrogance that had tried to reduce her in the first place. And deep down, Maya knew something else. If she gave in tonight, she wouldn't just lose her dignity. She'd set a precedent for every person watching. The silence stretched on. Khaled leaned back, confident the weight of pressure would force her to bend. The manager shifted uncomfortably, already imagining the fallout if she didn't. The staff peeked from the kitchen, holding their breath. And then, with steady calm, Maya spoke. "I will not apologize for understanding a language," she said. Her voice carried, clear enough for everyone in the room to hear. "I will not apologize for refusing to be belittled." A ripple passed through the restaurant, half shock, half admiration. Khaled's smirk faltered again. The very control he fought to reclaim slipped further from his grasp. The manager's face tightened, torn between fear of Khaled and admiration for Maya's courage. But Khaled wasn't finished. His smile returned, sharper this time. The smile of a predator cornered but not yet defeated. "Then you've made your choice," he said quietly, almost too quietly. "And so have I." It wasn't a threat shouted in anger. It was a promise whispered with certainty. And for Maya, those words carried more weight than any insult he had spoken before. The shift finally ended near midnight, but for Maya the night was far from over. She changed out of her uniform slowly, the adrenaline from the confrontation still burning in her veins. Her co-workers hovered around her, some whispering words of admiration, others warning her quietly. "Be careful," one of the older waiters said, his voice hushed. "Men like him, they don't forget, and they don't forgive." Maya nodded but didn't reply. She wasn't naive. She knew Khaled's promise had been more than empty words. It was the kind of threat that carried weight beyond the walls of the restaurant. Still, she refused to regret what she had said. Dignity wasn't something she was willing to trade for safety. As she stepped outside, the cool night air hit her face. The city was alive with movement. Cars honking, lights flickering, distant laughter from people spilling out of bars. But as she walked down the quiet street toward the bus stop, the weight of the evening pressed harder. She replayed the moment in her mind. His mocking words in Arabic, her reply, the stunned silence that followed. For a fleeting second, she smiled. She had spoken truth to power. But the smile faded when she noticed the black car parked across the street. Tinted windows, engine humming though it wasn't moving. She told herself it was nothing, but her instincts screamed otherwise. The car didn't follow when she boarded the bus, but its presence left a mark, a reminder that Khaled's reach extended into shadows she couldn't see. The next morning, the retaliation began. Maya arrived at the restaurant only to be met by the general manager in his office. His face was tight, his tone rehearsed. "I'm afraid we have to suspend you, effective immediately," he said. "It's complicated." The board received calls. Important clients expressed concerns. "Until this situation clears up, we can't risk further conflict." Her chest tightened. "So this is about him." The manager avoided her gaze. "You have to understand, Maya. People like Mr. Khaled, their word carries weight. We can't afford to lose our investors over a misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding?" she repeated, incredulous. "He insulted me. I spoke the truth. That's not a misunderstanding." But the decision had already been made. The paper was signed. Her badge was taken. And just like that, the job she had fought to keep, the job that paid her rent, that kept food on the table, was gone. Walking out of the restaurant felt heavier than any shift she'd ever worked. The staff avoided her eyes, torn between admiration and fear. They knew what had happened wasn't fair, but fairness had little place in a world built on power and money. Maya wandered through the city, her mind spinning. She thought about her grandmother's words, about dignity, about the cost of courage. Was this what it meant? To lose everything because she refused to bow her head? By evening, the whispers started. A friend from another restaurant called her, saying her name was circulating, that certain employers had been warned about her. A red flag whispered through the city's hospitality circles. Not for incompetence, not for dishonesty, but for standing up to the wrong man. It was Khaled's hand at work, invisible but undeniable. The humiliation he suffered had now become her punishment. But Maya wasn't broken. Not yet, because even as the walls closed in, she realized something important. He could strip her of a job, maybe even tarnish her reputation, but he couldn't erase what everyone had witnessed that night. And for some, that memory would outlast any smear campaign. Still, survival was no longer just about dignity. It was about finding a way to push back against a man who believed no one could touch him. And Maya, though she didn't yet know how, wasn't about to go quietly. The days after her suspension blurred together, heavy with silence and uncertainty. Maya spent her mornings pacing the small apartment she shared with her younger sister, rehearsing conversations in her mind that never came to pass. Bills sat unopened on the table, like silent accusers. Every time her phone buzzed, she half expected it to be another rejection, another door closing. And yet, something unexpected began to stir in the background. It started with a message. One of the bartenders from the restaurant, a young woman named Sophia, texted her late one night. "I just want you to know what you did. It meant something. We've all talked about it. Nobody's ever stood up to him before." Maya read the words twice, her chest tightening. She hadn't realized how much she needed to hear them. The following day, another message appeared, this time from a customer she barely remembered serving. "Saw what happened with that billionaire. Respect to you. Don't let them silence you." Within a week, her inbox filled with notes from people she didn't know. Employees from other restaurants, students, even strangers from across the city. Some had been at the restaurant that night, others had heard the story secondhand, but all carried the same message. Admiration, solidarity, and a quiet anger at the injustice. It was clear the confrontation hadn't stayed confined to four walls. Whispers had spread. Some retold it as gossip, others as a symbol. An ordinary waitress daring to respond to a man who believed money made him untouchable. But support, Maya realized, was a double-edged sword. For every message of encouragement, there was another laced with warning. Be careful. He ruins people. Don't let them find you alone. The weight of Khaled's power was undeniable. His network reached into banks, law firms, hotels, and restaurants. She could almost feel the shadow of his influence in every corner of the city. But still, something was shifting. A story had taken root. One afternoon, Maya ventured outside after days of hiding. At a cafe, she overheard two strangers talking at the next table. That waitress. The one who answered him in Arabic? Did you hear? Yeah, unbelievable. Took real guts. They say he tried to get her fired. He did. But you know what? People are starting to notice. Maybe money doesn't buy everything. Maya sipped her coffee, her hands trembling. For the first time, she realized the power wasn't entirely his. Words could spread faster than wealth, and stories could reach places his threats couldn't silence. That night, Sophia visited her apartment. She brought a bottle of cheap wine and nervous energy. "We've been talking," she said, glancing at Maya's sister asleep on the couch. "Some of us at the restaurant, we want to do something. We're tired of being afraid. He treats people like they're disposable. But you showed us he's not untouchable. We just don't know how to fight back without losing everything." Maya listened in silence. She didn't feel like a leader, not in the slightest. She was scared, unemployed, barely holding herself together. But she also knew something Sophia hadn't said aloud. The fight had already begun the moment she answered Khaled in his own language. As the city buzzed with whispers, and allies quietly revealed themselves, Maya faced a choice. She could retreat into obscurity, hoping the storm would pass, or she could step into the very spotlight Khaled had unintentionally created for her. And though her hands shook at the thought, a truth began to settle deep within her. Survival alone was no longer enough. The question was no longer whether she could endure his power. The question was whether she could turn the weight of his arrogance against him. Maya spent the next few days planning in silence. Every morning she woke up to the weight of uncertainty pressing on her chest. But every night, she went to bed with a tiny spark of resolve flickering in her mind. She had survived the storm of that evening, yes, but survival alone no longer satisfied her. If Khaled thought a moment of arrogance could dictate the course of her life, he was gravely mistaken. Her first step was subtle, reaching out to her newfound allies. Sophia became her confidant and strategist, quietly connecting Maya with former restaurant employees who had witnessed the power plays and understood the risk of speaking out. Each conversation was a careful dance, a balancing act between exposure and protection. They shared information, whispered warnings, and slowly built a map of the influence Khaled wielded. It wasn't long before Maya realized that her most potent weapon wasn't confrontation. It was visibility. Stories, once whispered behind closed doors, were already spreading in hushed tones across the city. People admired her courage, and their admiration had a momentum of its own. Each retelling painted Khaled as the arrogant villain and Maya as the unlikely hero who refused to bow. One afternoon, sitting at a small cafe, Maya drafted a simple post on a social media platform she barely used before. It was short, calculated, and honest. Sometimes speaking the truth is worth the cost. Stand tall, even when the world tries to silence you. She hesitated only a moment before hitting post, and then she watched, holding her breath, as the first wave of reactions rolled in. Likes, shares, comments of support. People she didn't know, strangers from different parts of the city, were reaching out. They were validating her courage, amplifying her voice, and, without realizing it, chipping away at Khaled's perceived invincibility. But this was only the beginning. Khaled, meanwhile, had become aware of the ripple. His calls to the restaurant had done nothing to suppress it. If anything, they had sparked more attention. For a man whose world revolved around control, this was infuriating. How dare a single waitress, without wealth or influence, disrupt his carefully curated reality? Determined, he began orchestrating a more calculated response. Emails were sent, contacts alerted, subtle warnings issued. Small moves in a chess game he believed he would always win. But Khaled had underestimated something fundamental. Momentum fueled by justice, by dignity, by the raw human desire to see arrogance humbled. Maya felt the pressure mounting, but she also felt a strange clarity. Fear was real, yes, but it was no longer paralyzing. Each message of support, each act of quiet solidarity, reminded her that she was not alone. She began to see patterns, opportunities, and even leverage. She realized that influence worked both ways. If wielded cleverly, it could turn a predator's power against him. The first concrete move came when one of the restaurant's loyal patrons, a journalist who had witnessed the confrontation, offered to tell the story publicly. Maya knew this step could escalate things dramatically, could make Khaled furious, could invite retaliation, but it could also strip him of the anonymity he relied on to intimidate others. Maya took a deep breath, weighing the risk against the potential impact. Courage, she realized, was never about the absence of fear. It was about moving forward in spite of it. And if she was going to fight back, if she was going to reclaim not just her dignity but her life, she had to start using the tools at her disposal. That night, she drafted an email to the journalist. Every word was deliberate, careful, unflinching. She told the story. Not the gossip, not the exaggeration, but the truth. The arrogance, the mockery, the defiance, and the stunned silence that followed. She emphasized the human side of it, the dignity, the courage, the lesson for anyone who had ever been belittled. As she hit send, Maya felt a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration. The tide had begun to turn, and she could sense it. The battle wasn't over, far from it. But for the first time, the fight felt like it might be hers to win. By the next morning, the city buzzed with whispers that refused to stay confined to private conversations. The journalist had published the story, a careful, balanced account that highlighted both Maya's courage and Khaled's arrogance. Within hours, it was shared across social media platforms, picked up by bloggers, and discussed on local news channels. What had been a single moment in a restaurant now rippled far beyond its walls. Maya woke to a flood of notifications. Messages of support, shares, and comments poured in from people she had never met. Ordinary citizens, fellow workers, and even strangers from far-flung corners of the city. Each notification carried an unmistakable message. We see you, we admire you, and we are with you. But alongside admiration came scrutiny. Khaled's influence meant that not all attention was positive. There were subtle attacks, anonymous posts questioning her professionalism, and thinly veiled threats. Still, Maya felt a strange calm. She had anticipated resistance. She had anticipated the storm. What she hadn't anticipated was how quickly the truth could galvanize people. Meanwhile, Khaled's morning began in a fury. He had awoken to dozens of alerts about the article, each one a reminder that his carefully controlled world was unraveling. He sat at his desk, his expensive leather chair creaking under the tension, scrolling through the posts and comments, realizing that the narrative was no longer his to command. How did she? He muttered, shaking with disbelief. A waitress, turned this into a spectacle? How dare she? His assistant, trembling slightly, tried to calm him. Sir, perhaps this could be an opportunity to control the damage? Khaled's eyes narrowed. Damage? He spat. This isn't damage. This is a direct affront to me. She must be punished. Publicly, privately, whatever it takes. No one crosses me and walks away unscathed. But the more he tried to orchestrate his influence, the more visible his desperation became. Every attempt to suppress the story only drew more attention to it. Journalists dug deeper. Social media users shared screenshots, reposted quotes, and debated the implications. The story had taken on a life of its own, fueled by courage and amplified by collective indignation. Back in her apartment, Maya watched the unfolding storm with measured eyes. She had expected fear and she had expected retaliation, but this was something beyond her calculations. It was proof of a principle she had always known but never experienced on this scale. When truth meets courage, even the most powerful attempts at domination can falter. Her phone buzzed again, this time from Sophia and other co-workers, offering updates about messages from readers, strangers offering support, and inquiries about the incident. It became clear that the restaurant's staff, though frightened, were emboldened. Witnesses who had remained silent were beginning to speak up, adding layers to the narrative. Maya felt a surge of responsibility. She had ignited something larger than herself, and she couldn't turn away now. The story wasn't just about defending her own dignity anymore. It was about challenging the idea that power could silence the voiceless. Khaled, on the other hand, was spiraling. The sense of control he once wielded effortlessly had evaporated. Every call he made to suppress the story was met with resistance or ignored outright. Each attempt to intimidate was countered by an ally, a witness, or the growing chorus of public support for Maya. For the first time in his life, he was learning what it felt like to be powerless. And for Maya, that realization brought a quiet vindication. She knew the battle wasn't over. Khaled would not give up easily, but she had taken the first decisive step in turning the tide. And sometimes that first step is the hardest yet the most vital. By the following morning, Maya could sense the storm gathering like a dark cloud on the horizon. Her social media feeds were alive with support, yes, but also with the subtle undercurrents of retaliation. Anonymous accounts began circulating vague threats, attempting to intimidate her and those close to her. She recognized the fingerprints of someone with vast resources and influence. Sure enough, by mid-afternoon, the first direct move landed. The restaurant manager, usually a composed figure, called her with a trembling voice. "Maya, they're investigating your references," he said. "It seems certain parties have reached out to previous employers, and, well, they're asking questions. Intense questions." Maya exhaled, feeling the chill of what was clearly Khaled's personal vendetta. His reach was long, and his sense of entitlement was frightening. But instead of panic, a calm focus settled over her. She had anticipated escalation, and she had prepared for it. Sophia was there, her presence a steadying anchor. "We expected this," she said. "It's not just you. They're trying to intimidate anyone who might back you up. We need to be smart." Maya nodded. Her first step was transparency. She documented everything: emails, calls, messages. Every attempt to undermine her. If Khaled was going to play the influence game, she would meet him with evidence and strategy, not fear. Meanwhile, Khaled was relentless. Emails went unanswered on purpose. He tried to pressure media outlets to remove the story. He whispered threats into ears that valued loyalty over justice. His resources were vast, his determination unyielding. But what he failed to account for was the momentum of truth. Maya's circle began to act strategically. Former colleagues, who had once been cautious, now shared statements about the incident, corroborating her story. Customers came forward, some even recording their encounters with Khaled's arrogance. Every attempt at intimidation was met with organized, careful resistance. One afternoon, a familiar black car parked across the street, engine idling, a reminder of the danger that still lurked. Maya noticed it but didn't flinch. She had learned that fear was a signal, not a command. Her allies moved with her, creating safe routines, verifying messages, and ensuring no one walked alone. By evening, Khaled's frustration was palpable. His empire of control had begun to crumble under the weight of narrative and solidarity. Attempts to isolate Maya were failing. Each move he made was countered not by one person, but by a network of support she had quietly built. Maya, sitting with her small team, realized the power she now held wasn't wealth. It was resilience, visibility, and unity. She had turned her vulnerability into strategy. Every threat that came her way became fuel for careful planning. Every whisper of fear transformed into deliberate action. Khaled, powerful though he was, could no longer dictate the story. The more he tried to bend reality, the more he revealed his desperation, and the more people rallied behind Maya. It was a lesson he had underestimated. Influence can intimidate, money can coerce, but courage, especially when supported by truth, cannot be bought and cannot be silenced. As night fell, Maya felt a quiet determination settle in her chest. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, she knew she had the tools and the allies to face whatever came next. Khaled had underestimated not just her, but the ripple effect of a single act of defiance. And in that realization, Maya found her strength. The following week felt like walking through a storm with no shelter. Khaled's maneuvers became increasingly aggressive. He sent legal notices, hinted at lawsuits, and quietly leveraged his connections to question Maya's credibility in professional circles. Even the quietest allies felt the tremors of his influence. But Maya had learned to anticipate these moves. Every action he took was met with preparedness. Every attempt to isolate her countered by a web of support she had cultivated. It began with the media. A local news station, intrigued by the viral story, reached out for an interview. Maya knew this was a pivotal moment. If handled poorly, it could become a liability, but if managed wisely, it could solidify her position and turn the tables on Khaled. With Sophia's support, she prepared carefully. They went over the key points: honesty, clarity, dignity. No exaggeration, no provocation, just truth delivered with composure. It was a balancing act, and one misstep could be exploited by Khaled's lawyers or smear campaigns. When the cameras rolled, Maya spoke calmly and precisely. She recounted the events at the restaurant, emphasizing not the insult itself, but the courage it took to stand up to someone who believed his wealth placed him above accountability. She spoke about dignity, about respect, and about the small acts of defiance that inspire others to challenge injustice. Her words resonated, and viewers felt it. An ordinary woman articulating extraordinary resolve. Social media erupted almost immediately. Clips from the interview were shared, memes praising her courage circulated, and hashtags supporting Maya began trending locally. The story had grown legs of its own, fueled not just by her bravery, but by the collective admiration of people who recognized themselves in her defiance. Khaled, watching from his office, grew more frustrated by the hour. The more he attempted to manipulate perception, the more visible his desperation became. Legal threats, influence over business contacts, even veiled intimidation, none of it could compete with the velocity of public opinion. Inside her apartment, Maya sat with her team, strategizing the next steps. Each ally brought information, observations, and ideas. They identified journalists sympathetic to their story, traced social media trends, and coordinated responses to Khaled's attempts at suppression. The momentum was theirs, and every calculated move strengthened their position. Yet, Maya remained cautious. She knew that visibility came with risk. Khaled's influence, though waning in public perception, was still formidable behind closed doors. She instructed her allies to maintain discretion, to document every interaction, and to avoid confrontations that could be manipulated against them. Strategy became as essential as courage. Despite the looming threat, there was a quiet exhilaration in the air. Maya could feel the tide beginning to shift. Each act of support, each retweet, each witness statement chipped away at Khaled's aura of invincibility. People were no longer just observing, they were rooting for her, empowered by her stand, and inspired to speak out in their own spheres. By the end of the week, Khaled's calculated world of control had begun to crumble. The arrogance that once demanded obedience was now met with collective scrutiny, and the ripple Maya had started in a single restaurant had become a wave she could ride strategically. For the first time, she realized that power, when unchecked by accountability, is fragile, and that courage, amplified by solidarity, can become a force far stronger than money or influence. Khaled's patience had long since vanished. Every attempt to quietly intimidate Maya had failed. His influence, once unchallenged, was slipping through his fingers, and with each failed move, his frustration morphed into desperation. By midweek, it became clear that subtlety was no longer an option for him. He needed a direct, aggressive strike. It began with an unexpected email to Maya's former employers. Posing as a client, Khaled painted a misleading picture, suggesting she had behaved unprofessionally and hinting that hiring her would be a liability. But Maya, anticipating escalation, had already reached out to her references, preemptively informing them of potential interference. Their responses were swift and unequivocal, reinforcing her professionalism and honesty. Then came the social media storm. Khaled's team tried to manipulate hashtags, planting false narratives designed to smear her reputation. Yet, the more they pushed, the more people rallied around her. The algorithm, it seemed, favored authenticity over manipulation. Clips from her interview, screenshots of her interactions, and heartfelt support from strangers continued to circulate, overwhelming the attempts to tarnish her image. One evening, Maya received a text that made her blood run cold. An anonymous message warning her not to leave her apartment. A black car had been seen lingering near her street. The intimidation was unmistakable. Sophia and the team quickly coordinated, arranging rides and checking in constantly. Maya felt the tension tighten like a vice, but fear was no longer paralyzing. It had become focus. She began to recognize a pattern. Khaled's attacks, though aggressive, were public-facing. They relied on intimidation, but they left traces. Documentation became her shield. Public visibility became her weapon. By simply existing in the light, surrounded by witnesses and supporters, she diminished his capacity to strike without consequence. With careful planning, Maya and her allies began to amplify this visibility. They organized community statements, coordinated social media responses, and even reached out to journalists who had followed the story. Each move was deliberate, aimed at ensuring that any attack from Khaled would be met with scrutiny, public attention, and evidence of transparency. Khaled's frustration escalated with every counteraction. The more he tried to suppress, the more attention his actions drew. His network of influence, once sufficient to control outcomes quietly, proved ineffective against a narrative backed by truth, courage, and collective support. Maya, despite the pressure, felt a growing sense of empowerment. Each act of aggression from Khaled was predictable, and predictability allowed her to strategize. The fear that had accompanied the initial days of confrontation had been transformed into calculation. She was no longer reacting blindly. She was moving purposefully, turning threat into opportunity. By the weekend, the public conversation had shifted decisively. Khaled was no longer seen as untouchable. People questioned his behavior, speculated about his methods, and admired Maya's resolve. The narrative had turned. What began as a single act of defiance in a restaurant now resonated across a city, proving that influence can intimidate, but it cannot extinguish truth. Maya realized that the fight wasn't just about her dignity anymore. It was about creating a space where accountability mattered, where courage could be witnessed, and where one voice, if strong and supported, could challenge the most formidable of powers. And in that realization, she found clarity. The battle was no longer just survival, it was leverage. And leverage, when wielded wisely, could turn even the most desperate enemy into a witness to his own unraveling. Maya had reached a turning point. The days of reactive defense were behind her. Each threat, each attempt at intimidation, each smear campaign had been met with meticulous preparation and unyielding resolve. Now, it was time to move from defense to offense, to turn the tide decisively in her favor. The opportunity came through a media contact who had been following her story from the beginning. A televised interview, live, with millions of viewers expected to tune in. It was an immense risk. Khalid's resources were vast, and any misstep could be exploited against her. But Maya understood the stakes. Her silence would allow him to retain the upper hand. Her voice, spoken clearly and with conviction, could shift the narrative irreversibly. In the days leading up to the broadcast, she prepared meticulously. She rehearsed her words with Sophia, went over potential traps, anticipated questions designed to unsettle her, and built a concise narrative that emphasized truth, dignity, and resilience. This wasn't about revenge, it was about exposure, about holding power accountable. When the camera lights illuminated her, Maya felt a rush of clarity. She recounted the restaurant incident, the arrogance and mockery of Khalid, and her immediate, dignified response. She spoke about the consequences she had faced, the suspension, the subtle threats, and the attempts to silence her. She emphasized not the fear, but the courage required to confront inequality and arrogance. As she spoke, the public's reaction was palpable. Social media buzzed with clips and quotes almost immediately. People admired not only her courage but also her strategic composure. What could have been perceived as vulnerability was instead transformed into strength. Khalid's reputation began to falter under the weight of public scrutiny. The narrative had shifted. No longer was Maya simply a target of retaliation. She had become a symbol. Her defiance, her dignity, and her strategic use of media attention resonated with viewers, amplifying the story far beyond the original incident. Support poured in from unexpected places: former employees, community leaders, even industry professionals who had previously remained silent. Khalid's attempts to regain control only amplified the attention. Legal threats and quiet intimidation were now seen as overreach, fueling further public sympathy for Maya. Every misstep on his part became evidence of his arrogance and the lengths he would go to suppress dissent. By the end of the week, Maya had transformed her narrative from one of personal defiance into a broader story about courage, accountability, and the fragility of unchecked power. She had leveraged the attention she once feared into a shield, using visibility and support as both protection and weapon. In that moment, she realized a profound truth. Influence and money could intimidate, but they could not suppress authenticity. Courage, amplified by collective support and strategic thinking, had created an unassailable position. And as Maya looked at the response, the messages of support flooding in from strangers and allies alike, she knew that the fight had evolved. It was no longer just about her dignity. It was about changing the rules of the game entirely, proving that no one, no matter how powerful, could remain untouchable when confronted with truth, strategy, and unwavering resolve. Khalid's frustration had reached its breaking point. Every attempt to control the narrative, every subtle intimidation, every threat had failed. Public opinion had turned sharply against him, and his carefully curated image of power was crumbling before millions of eyes. Desperation replaced strategy, and in desperation, he acted recklessly. The move was bold, audacious, and deeply personal. He leaked private communications, manipulated documents, and attempted to frame Maya as the instigator of a fabricated controversy. The plan relied on speed and shock. Before the public could rally, before Maya could respond, before anyone could see through the manipulation. But Maya was ready. She had anticipated escalation. Her documentation was meticulous. Every threat, every interaction, every attempt at coercion had been logged, saved, and strategically shared with trusted allies and journalists. Her network was prepared for the worst-case scenario, and their solidarity was unwavering. When Khalid's desperate maneuver became public, it backfired spectacularly. Analysts dissected the documents and communications, exposing discrepancies and deliberate manipulations. The more he tried to paint Maya as deceitful, the more evidence revealed his own malice and arrogance. Public sentiment, already swaying, now solidified into outright condemnation. Maya took the opportunity to speak again, this time through a carefully crafted statement and a live interview. She didn't just defend herself. She highlighted the broader implications of unchecked power and systemic intimidation. She spoke with clarity, dignity, and an unwavering resolve that resonated deeply with the audience. Power isn't in money, she said, and influence isn't in intimidation. True strength is in integrity, courage, and the ability to stand for what is right, even when the odds are stacked against you. Social media erupted. Hashtags supporting Maya Sword, trending nationally. The leaked manipulations were scrutinized and criticized, amplifying her credibility and highlighting Khaled's recklessness. Former skeptics now acknowledged her courage. Industry leaders praised her resilience. The story had become a public lesson in accountability and dignity. Khaled, observing the fallout, realized his influence had reached its limits. His desperate attempt to regain control not only failed, but it further dismantled the very aura of invincibility he had long relied upon. Every move he had made to suppress or intimidate had been turned against him by Maya's foresight, strategy, and courage. For Maya, the victory wasn't just personal, it was symbolic. She had transformed an act of individual defiance into a collective lesson. Her strategy had combined visibility, careful documentation, public engagement, and the support of allies into a force that money and influence could not override. By the end of that week, the city recognized a shift. Maya was no longer a target or a victim. She was a symbol of resilience, a figure demonstrating that courage paired with strategy could challenge the seemingly untouchable. Khaled's power, formidable though it had once been, was now a cautionary tale, a reminder that arrogance can crumble in the face of truth. And as Maya looked at the messages of support flooding her inbox, the encouragement from strangers, and the unwavering solidarity of her allies, she felt a profound clarity. The battle had not only been about surviving, it had been about claiming agency, wielding courage strategically, and proving that dignity, truth, and resolve can overcome even the most formidable opposition. Victory, she realized, was not in retaliation. It was in transforming fear into strategy, defiance into influence, and isolation into collective power. The culmination of weeks of tension, strategy, and courage arrived quietly, yet with unmistakable force. Maya's calculated resilience had turned what began as a moment of insult in a restaurant into a story that inspired a city, captured national attention, and shook a powerful billionaire to his core. But the final act demanded one decisive move: the public exposure of Khaled's manipulations in their entirety. Maya and her team had prepared for this moment. Every leaked email, every subtle threat, every attempt to undermine her credibility was documented meticulously. They compiled evidence, screenshots, witness statements, and corroborating reports into a clear, undeniable narrative. This was not just about defending herself. It was about showing the world the lengths to which unchecked power could go to silence an individual. A live press conference was arranged. The room buzzed with anticipation. Cameras, journalists, and supporters filled the space. Maya stepped forward, calm but resolute, a figure who had transformed fear into strategy and defiance into influence. She began by recounting the original incident: Khaled's mockery, the suspension, the subtle threats, and the escalation of intimidation. Then she presented the evidence not as an attack, but as truth. Each document, each message, each attempt at manipulation was laid bare. The audience saw it all: the arrogance, the desperation, the unraveling control of a man who had believed his wealth placed him above accountability. "This isn't just my story," Maya said, her voice steady, unwavering. "It's a lesson in courage, in dignity, and in the power of collective support. No one, no matter how powerful, can silence truth when it is witnessed, documented, and shared." The reaction was immediate. Social media exploded. Hashtags supporting Maya dominated national trends. News outlets covered the conference extensively, highlighting not just her courage, but the meticulous strategy that had ensured her victory. Public opinion had shifted completely. Khaled was no longer an untouchable figure. He was a cautionary tale. Maya's allies celebrated quietly, knowing that their solidarity had been pivotal. Each step, every small act of courage, every strategic decision had contributed to this moment. The battle had been won not through confrontation alone, but through careful planning, visibility, and the harnessing of collective voices. As the press conference concluded, Maya looked directly into the cameras, addressing viewers around the world. "If there's one thing to take away from this story," she said, "it's that courage combined with strategy can turn fear into power. Stand up for yourself, document the truth, and never underestimate the ripple effect of one voice amplified by many." And then she added, with a small smile that carried both resolve and invitation, "If this story inspired you, take a moment to subscribe, comment, and share. Your voice matters, and together we can ensure that courage is never silenced." The message resonated. Messages of support continued to pour in. Maya had not only defended her dignity but transformed it into influence. She had taken a moment of personal defiance and elevated it into a symbol of accountability, courage, and empowerment. Weeks later, Khaled's attempts at damage control had failed completely. His reputation was tarnished, his influence diminished, and the lesson was clear. Power without integrity is fragile, and truth amplified by courage is unstoppable. Maya, meanwhile, had emerged not just victorious but transformed. She understood that fear, when met with preparation, clarity, and solidarity, could become the very catalyst for empowerment. The story that began in a single restaurant had become a movement, a proof that one person's voice, strategically and courageously wielded, could challenge even the most formidable forces. And with that, she looked toward the future, not as a victim, but as a leader, a symbol, and a reminder that integrity and courage are more powerful than wealth or intimidation. "Remember," she concluded for the final time, "stand tall, speak truth, and never let fear dictate your story. Subscribe, comment, and share this message, because together, we are unstoppable." Weeks turned into months, but the echoes of that fateful confrontation in the restaurant never faded. Maya's story had become more than a single incident. It had evolved into a movement, a reminder that courage could ripple far beyond the moment it was first expressed. She often sat quietly in her apartment, reflecting on the journey she had endured and the transformation it had brought not only to her life but to the lives of those around her. She remembered the first night after Khaled's mockery, the anger that surged through her, and the fear that threatened to paralyze her. At that time, she had been uncertain if she would have the strength to respond, uncertain if the world would notice, uncertain if justice was even possible. But looking back now, she realized that the decision to speak, to act with dignity and clarity, had been the turning point. Courage, she understood, was not the absence of fear. It was the choice to move forward despite it. Her life had changed dramatically. Formerly quiet and reserved, she found herself at the center of conversations about integrity, courage, and accountability. Invitations to speak, write, and mentor began to arrive. People she had never met reached out, sharing their own stories of standing up against unfair treatment, of moments where they had been silenced or dismissed, and how her example had inspired them to reclaim their voices. Maya felt a profound sense of responsibility. She had learned that influence was not something that could be demanded or bought. It was something that could be earned through authenticity and courage. Even Khaled's downfall served as a poignant lesson. His relentless pursuit of control, his arrogance, and his belief that wealth could shield him from accountability had been dismantled not by revenge, but by truth amplified through strategy and solidarity. Maya often reflected on this irony. The more someone clings to unchecked power, the more fragile that power becomes when confronted with collective conscience. Yet, the story was not simply about victory. It was about reflection. Maya began sharing her insights in interviews, panels, and social media posts. She spoke about the ripple effect of standing up, about the power of documentation, about the strength found in alliances and collective action. But most importantly, she spoke about the inner transformation that comes from choosing dignity over fear. Courage, she emphasized, was not a one-time act but a continuous practice, a daily decision to hold oneself accountable, to act ethically, and to amplify truth even when it is uncomfortable. One evening, as the sun set over the city, Maya visited the very restaurant where it all began. It looked ordinary on the outside, just another building among many. But to her, it was hallowed ground, a symbol of turning adversity into power. She remembered the moment she had stood her ground, the laughter and mockery, the stunned silence that followed, and the journey that had cascaded from that single moment. She understood now that heroism is often quiet, unnoticed at first, and sometimes begins with a single, simple choice: to speak the truth. She thought of the countless people who had been inspired by her story, the waitstaff who had gained confidence to assert themselves, the readers who had decided to confront injustice in their workplaces, the strangers who had found courage to act in their communities. Maya realized that her moment of defiance had become a mirror, reflecting back the potential for courage in every individual who witnessed it. The power of one act of integrity, amplified by solidarity, could indeed change the course of lives. As she stepped out into the cool evening air, Maya felt a sense of calm she had never known before. Fear and uncertainty, once constant companions, had been replaced with clarity and purpose. She understood that the journey was ongoing, that challenges would continue to arise, but she also knew that resilience, integrity, and courage were tools no one could take away. These were the instruments through which she, and anyone inspired by her story, could navigate the complexities of life with dignity. And in that quiet reflection, Maya whispered to herself, not as a boast, but as a realization. True strength is not in defeating others, but in standing unwaveringly for what is right. And the ripple of courage begins the moment we choose to speak. For the audience, the story lingered, leaving a reflective weight. It was a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming power, one individual's courage could spark change, inspire solidarity, and create a legacy that transcends fear and intimidation. Maya's journey was more than a tale of confrontation. It was a testament to the profound human truth. Integrity, bravery, and strategic resolve are forces that no amount of wealth or arrogance can suppress. As the epilogue closed, viewers were left to ponder their own lives. Where had they allowed fear to silence them? When had they dismissed the power of truth because it seemed too small, too insignificant, or too risky? Maya's story became a mirror, a challenge, and an inspiration. To stand, to act, to document, and to amplify the truth. If Maya's journey has moved you, her final voiceover encouraged, soft yet resolute, take a step today. Speak, act, and share your truth. Subscribe, comment, and share this story. Because courage grows when it is witnessed, and the world changes when we choose to act. The epilogue left the audience not with closure alone, but with reflection, empowerment, and a sense of responsibility. It reminded them that courage is contagious, that integrity is transformative, and that a single voice, when strategically and fearlessly wielded, can indeed ripple into a force that even the most powerful cannot ignore.